Hey, 42 here. You probably associate fairy tales with a sweeter, more innocent time in your life. Perhaps your mum or dad used to read them to you whilst you were tucked up underneath your duvet in paisley pyjamas, dreaming of faraway lands where stepmothers were bad news. Little girls wore Red Riding Hoods, and magic beans were a sound financial investment. A place where bad people got what was coming to them, and good people lived happily ever after. But what 5-year-old you probably didn't know was the stories you were being fed were heavily sanitized versions of the originals. And I don't mean cleaned up a bit with some spit and polish, more like scrubbed down with a wire brush and bleach. In their unedited, now largely forgotten forms, most fairy tales were, in reality, stories of murder, cannibalism, rape, dismemberment, and incest, seasoned with a sprinkling of child abuse, racism, and gratuitous violence. Imagine Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, directed by Quentin Tarantino after a bad breakup, and you'll have a sense of what I mean. Not exactly bedtime fodder for little munchkins. These fairy stories would have made your average fairy themselves. Although the term fairy tale was coined in the late 17th century, these stories have roots that go back a very long way in both spoken and written history, with some thought to be up to 6,000 years old. Fairy tales are embedded deeply within cultures. They're essentially a set of master narratives intended to influence people's beliefs and values, as well as shape their behaviour. They regularly contain a culture's spiritual and moral codes, and often build on real events. They're also repeated in cultures across the world. The story of Cinderella, for instance, isn't only found in Europe. A version of the same tale is also found in the West Indies, where it isn't a pumpkin that transforms into a carriage, but breadfruit. In ancient China, the story probably dates back to the 9th century and tells how a servant girl loses a slipper made of gold. The oldest known version of the Cinderella folktale, about a slave girl called Rhodopis, was popular in ancient Greece. Rhodopis' leather sandal is stolen by an eagle while she's bathing. I hate it when that happens. When the eagle drops the sandal in the lap of the king, he's so overcome by its beautiful shape that he sends men all over the kingdom to find its owner. Eventually, Rhodopis is found and made queen, forever satisfying the king's obvious foot fetish. In the Egyptian version of the story, Cinderella wears practical-sounding red leather slippers, not the high-maintenance glass kind. That detail was added in the 17th century by French writer Charles Perrault, who compiled many of the stories that would become well-known fairy tales, including Sleeping Beauty. I give you all this detail, not because I have a thing for women's shoes, honestly, I don't, but to highlight how the fairy tales you know so well actually have dramatically different narratives depending on who's telling them. In some versions of Cinderella, the heroine isn't helped by a fairy godmother, but by her own dead mother, who reappears as some form of domestic animal or lives incarnated in a hazel tree. Likewise, Cinderella doesn't always go to a ball. Sometimes it's a festival or church. And in some versions, there's no swapping of slippers at all. Cinderella's identity is proved by a ring that fits only her finger. The details vary so much because what we think of as fairy tales were originally just folk stories, mostly handed down through an oral tradition of storytelling. And as cultures mixed across the centuries through human migration and trading, the stories mixed with them. As you probably know, the famed Brothers Grimm provided the source material for most of the fairy tales we tell today, at least in the Western world. But the stories they recorded in Grimm's fairy tales were by no means original. In fact, the collection was an attempt to preserve these ancient tales for future generations. It's safe to say that went pretty well. The Grimms interviewed relatives, friends, and pretty much anyone else they could find to hunt down traditional folk stories. Their most prolific contributor was Dorothy Pearson Veman. who had heard many tales from travellers at a popular inn owned by her father. Like a lot of things you hear down the local boozer, these stories weren't exactly suitable for children's ears. But the Grimms didn't let that worry them too much. Despite the fact their book was targeted at kids, it was packed full of X-rated content. Rapunzel let down her hair each night so that the dashing prince could climb the tower for some Netflix and chill. The long-haired princess was eventually banished from the kingdom after getting pregnant with the prince's illegitimate child. And in The Frog Prince, let's just say the princess was only just getting started when she kissed a frog. Although, thankfully, she did wait until the amphibian had transformed into a human being before advancing past first base. After receiving some, frankly understandable, criticism for filling a children's book with boats and hoes, the Grimms did tone down some of the sexual themes in later editions of the fairy tales, but perhaps to get their own back on the spoilsports trying to censor them, the brothers upped the gratuitous violence to make up for it. In one version of Cinderella, the stepsisters cut off parts of their own feet in order to try and wedge their shoes into Cinder's lost slipper. When their deception is found out, a couple of doves fly down and peck the sisters' eyes out. In a lesser-known fairy tale called The Robber Bridegroom, criminals kidnap a young woman and force her to drink wine until her heart explodes before stripping her naked and chopping her body into pieces. In The Goose Maid, a woman is chucked into a barrel filled with spikes and pulled through the streets. And in Snow White, the Wicked Queen is forced to dance in red-hot iron shoes until she collapses and dies. In another story called The Juniper Tree, the stepmother, yes, another one, is so consumed with hatred, she decapitates her stepson. She then balances his head on top of his body and uses a scarf to hide the cut. When her daughter enters the room and asks why her stepbrother looks so pale, the stepmother suggests the girl give the boy a slap to revive him. Naturally, the boy's head falls off, and the wicked stepmother convinces the little girl she's murdered her sibling. To hide the evidence, they chop up the boy's body and turn it into a stew, which is then served to his father. Yeah, it's brutal stuff, but not at all unusual in Grimm's fairy tales, where plenty of violence is aimed at children. In Frau Trude, a girl who doesn't listen to her parents gets turned into a block of wood and thrown into the fire by a witch. In Snow White, the little girl is only 7 years old when the huntsman is told to take her to the forest, kill her, and bring back her liver and lungs for the queen to consume. Child cannibalism is another theme that runs through these tales. In The Juniper Tree, Dad unwittingly eats son, and if you remember the story of Hansel and Gretel, you'll recall that two children who run away after hearing they're soon to be abandoned almost get eaten by a witch. Except in the original version of the story, it's not the awful stepmother who decides the children must be left to fend for themselves, it's the children's own mother and father. That detail offers a clue as to why children are so badly treated in these stories. You see, life for young people in the 1800s was mostly pretty awful. The Industrial Revolution saw families living in poverty and squalid conditions. As a result, children were regularly abandoned, sold, or forced to work as expendable labor. The story of Snow White, for example, is possibly based on the real-life story of Marguerite von Waldeck, a 16th century Bavarian noblewoman. Marguerite's brother put small children to work in his copper mine, the physical labor deforming them so much they became known as dwarfs. As well as reflecting the time in which they were written, there's another reason these stories were so graphic: to scare the living crap out of children. Scaring youngsters into good behavior is still pretty common these days, but 150 years ago, it was standard practice. Striking fear into the hearts of children was often linked to religion and avoiding hell, which isn't really all that different to how many religions sell their wares, even today. It's hard to believe that Grimm's fairy tales could have been any darker, but they also had a healthy dose of anti-Semitism thrown in for good measure. Which is probably why the Nazis adopted Grimm's tales for propaganda purposes and made them compulsory reading in every German school. After a little adaptation, of course. Little Red Riding Hood became symbolic of the German people, tormented by the Jewish wolf, and Cinderella was apparently Aryan, which was what distinguished her from her stepsisters and made them so jealous. After the Second World War, these books and stories were banned in some places, but even when stripped of sex, violence, and Nazi symbolism, fairy tales still come under fire. As you probably know, even squeaky clean Disney have had their share of heat for reinforcing negative racial and gender stereotypes over the years. It's strange to think that the fairy tales enjoyed by millions of children around the world were once horror stories full of murder, cannibalism, and torture. But folk tales have always acted as a kind of magic mirror on the wall, reflecting humanity's own fears, struggles, and prejudices right back at us. And let's face it, it's been clear for some time that we humans aren't always the fairest of them all. Thanks for watching.